I'm Emma Butterworth, and for years I've been fascinated by the Troubles in Northern Ireland, a 30-year sectarian conflict that ended with the 1998 Good Friday Agreement. This agreement set up a new government in Northern Ireland named the Northern Irish Assembly, which was to represent both nationalists and unionists with more devolved powers from Westminster. As well as this, armed groups agreed to dispose of their weapons, prisoners involved in the conflict were released, and British military presence in Northern Ireland was scaled back. 26 years after the agreement, I went to Northern Ireland to see some of the country's history and speak to some charities who are working towards the country's future. So today we're going to go and head into Derry. Got quite a few things to see over there. Specifically, I want to go and see the Peace Bridge, a few of the memorials and the murals, and the Derry Walls. So let's go. The violent conflict was rooted in the region's divided identity between Unionists who wanted to remain part of the UK and Nationalists who sought reunification with Ireland. This conflict involved paramilitary violence, sectarian clashes, and civil rights struggles, leading to over 3,500 deaths. Derry, also known as Londonderry, was a key flashpoint during the Troubles. It was the site of significant events like the 1969 Battle of the Bogside, a major riot that marks the start of widespread violence, and Bloody Sunday in 1972, where British soldiers shot and killed unarmed civil rights protesters, escalating the conflict. Derry's large Catholic population and its history of discrimination made it a focal point for the civil rights movement and subsequent clashes during the Troubles. In Derry, key sites related to the Troubles include the Free Derry Corner and the Bogside murals, which depict significant events like Bloody Sunday. The Museum of Free Derry offers in-depth exhibits on the conflict, while the Bloody Sunday Memorial honours the victims and the Peace Bridge symbolises the city's efforts at reconciliation. These locations provide a powerful insight into Derry's roles during the Troubles. Following this trip and back in Belfast, I went to talk to Mark Thompson, who is the CEO of the charity Relatives for Justice. They build and provide access to safe, integrated, and professional services and programs of support for those who were bereaved or injured as a result of the conflict.
Well, Relatives for Justice is a non governmental organisation, an NGO, and a charity supporting victims and survivors of the conflict. It was established in April 1991. The key people who established it were people who'd been doing human rights work for the previous 2 decades, throughout the 1970s and 80s, and an organisation called the Association for Legal Justice, the ALJ. That was a priest, Monsignor Raymond Murray, who was a prison chaplain to women prisoners in Armagh prison, people who were incarcerated there during the conflict, and Claire Riley, an auxiliary nurse who happened to have a phone and whose five brothers, the youngest of 15, had all been interned in the 1970s. Claire had also got a cousin killed in the conflict and a brother killed in the conflict. And in a sense, they'd been doing human rights work. The 1990s, when RFJ was founded, there'd been a backdrop from the mid to late 80s of quite a serious number of killings in which there was prima facie evidence of collusion with illegal paramilitaries in the killing of Republicans, nationalists, and Catholics. And so the organisation was brought together in 1991 in St Patrick's Hall in Dungannon, which people will tell you is the epicenter of everything in Ireland, where everything began from history onwards. But nonetheless, great people brought the organisation together and brought families together. And some very initial objectives were set, like ventilating the issues, bringing a spotlight, shining a spotlight into the experiences that families had encountered, and to give a voice. And it's probably important to remember it was during a time where the conflict was intensified. It was quite dangerous. There was around 30,000 armed British soldiers in the north, which is a small geographical area, with a population of just under 1.5 million at the time. There was a police force that was primarily um, loyal to the British state. It was comprised of 100% unionist on its ethos and its outlook. I think it was 96 or 95% Protestant. those Catholics that were in it would have been supportive of the UK and maintaining the Union. And so it placed these areas and militarised these areas, particularly nationalist and Republican areas, with a particular slant and bias at best, and prejudice, and at worst, with violence. Like I was a kid moving through these areas, my experience growing up, and my father is a Protestant whose father served in the British Army, who happened to fall in love with a Catholic in the early 1960s, and who was an engineer and who got sacked for marrying a Catholic. So the history of the creation of the Northern State and the partition of Ireland in its 32 counties after the War of Independence, which saw the British leave 26 counties, and then the civil war over about whether they should accept the treaty or not, left a kind of inbuilt majority in the northeastern part of the island with 6 counties out of the 32 under British rule. And within that, there was the creation of a unionist majority, whereby if you had 10 homes or 10 businesses, you got 10 votes. If you owned 30 homes and 30 businesses, you had 30 votes. And so there was a very gerrymandered, controlled, partitioned form of apartheid, where Catholics were discriminated against in terms of employment, housing, and the allocation of housing. And there was an economic and structural form of violence that further alienated Catholics, that were treated with suspicion by Unionists, who were always holding their territory and militarising their territory. I suppose in the 1960s, there was a civil rights movement in America, civil rights movements just around parts of Europe, around being led by students. And I suppose the inspiration of that had a knock-on effect, and it kind of it spilled into here. And students and civil rights protesters began to march, looking one person, one vote, equal housing, equal opportunities. It wasn't about even Irish reunification, it wasn't about partition, it was really about within the Northern State, there was a two-tier system. So it was about ending that. And when those students began to march, they were met by violence, by probably people that you would describe as fundamentalist and right wing and religious, who saw Catholicism as something, as an abomination, and saw that the loyal Protestants to the loyal crown and stuff like that, but also the RUC police force. So together there was a coalition of attacking the civil rights marches and beating them, and that kind of led to kind of a resurfacing of, I suppose, of Republican politics, and the IRA entered the equation. When I would have grown up in this community, like in West Belfast, I'm from Twinbrook, even moving around as a teenager, going to school, I stopped by British soldiers regularly. And they would emptied your school books out or your sports bag, held you for whatever length of time. And at times physically assaulted you, slapped you, kicked you, held you, bent you over, punched you, whatever. Things like that. The abnormal way of living was a normal way of living. But in a sense, I can understand, user from Manchester, you've maybe a couple of lads or girls in Manchester, and maybe they think, oh, it's great to join the British Army, and then maybe they leave school, maybe they're not highly qualified, maybe there's an opportunity to be trained in the British Army to do engineering or whatever. And the next thing you end up in Belfast or Derry. And I didn't expect this. So, I would have often had an open mind to all of that, but a very sharp political analysis of what was right and what was wrong, and the default lines and so forth. So in the context of Relatives for Justice, and in the context of dealing with the legacy and the residue of all the unresolved issues that affected people in the community, principally affected by British state actions perpetrated by British soldiers or the RUC after the collusion, there was no way to ventilate that. And Relatives for Justice gave a platform to do that and set ourselves clear objectives in terms of bringing court cases to Europe, to the European Court of Human Rights, challenging the local failures in the criminal justice system to hold the account perpetrators when they were state actors, and highlighting that and bringing in groups like Amnesty and other international organisations to kind of educate. And in the context of doing all of that, the organisation was ad hoc. And then the ceasefires came in 1994. And I provided a space for people to reflect, and people that hadn't hitherto come forward to present themselves to say, here's my experience, or I now feel safe to speak out. So there's a lot of that. So we decided by around 97, 96, 97 that we needed to kind of structurally look at what was required within our community as an organisation in terms of supporting people. And we opened up offices. And for my sins, it's like Hotel California. Once you get in, you kind of don't get out. But I kind of drove the process and then became employed. And then with a few volunteers, we just opened up and organically began to provide services. Some of the people around the organisation, including myself, have experience in international aid projects globally. So I would have spent time in Central and Latin America, Cuba, Palestine, other people in South Africa and other African countries through aid projects. So we had a bit of a sense of transitional justice, transformation, political transformation from conflict to peace, all of the issues and challenges that brings, but nonetheless, the very human dimension of all of that in terms of how that impacts people's lives and the trauma that it brings. So we put together programs and projects to deal with that and to develop the organisation and shape it around the needs of the people that were members and beneficiaries. The key issues are justice and accountability for what happened, addressing the trauma and the impact that has in the residue, and the transgenerational trauma. To give you an example, what is transgenerational trauma? Well, if you're a 10 or 12 or 15-year-old and one of your parents is killed or a sibling is killed, it's how your family coped and managed during the 1970s and 80s. So maybe if it was your sibling that was killed, your parents were fearful. The transgenerational aspect of that is that we are now dealing with adults who have children of their own, and their parenting skills are probably overprotective. So the kids, even today, our grandkids are going out. They need to hear constantly from them on a mobile phone, are you safe? Are you okay? Even though the conflict's ended. Or the transgenerational impact is that they didn't finish school and their education was impacted. Or their economic opportunities were impacted. So you're dealing with multi-layered aspects of trauma and transgenerational trauma in terms of how you recover, how you heal, how you deal with this. And the centrality of that is about accountability as well, and acknowledgement and recognition. So if a state is responsible through its soldiers or police or through third parties of colluding and they kill your relative, the state isn't going to investigate that and hold to account the perpetrators. It's up to you to campaign to do that. So the emphasis and the onus is put on you to do that. So it's not as if you're killed, or you had someone killed, and you can rely and have trust and confidence in the criminal justice system and the forces of law in order to act in your behalf. It's the complete opposite. They do everything to put every barrier up and prevent accountability, and it's your job to dismantle that and go through it lawfully and legally and use the law. So we're engaged in a lot of that work. To give you an example, today we have 53 staff. We operate from several centres. So 32 of those staff are employed directly. The rest are contracted in. So who do we contract in? Well, there are 3 clinical psychologists who are doctors in the health service. 2 of them are relatives who had people killed, okay, and they're members of RFJ. So they do our clinical assessments professionally, and then they refer to a bank of a dozen trauma counsellors and who is appropriate and people get counselling. We're the only organisation to have clinical psychologists in our system, although we never get the credit for what we do because we're always pigeonholed as something else. But we're very professional in what we do. So we have the trauma counselling, the mental health project. We're registered with the British Association for Counselling and Psychotherapy. We're accredited, probably put our ears on everything that we do. Then we have a complementary intervention medical process of complementary medicines and therapies. So, for example, if people are dependent on substances or alcohol or prescription drugs, or they have issues of their nerves. I'll give you an example. We go to court a lot with families. So a family going to court the night before the night sleep might have irritable bowel syndrome as a consequence of their anxiety and their stress. So we help to relieve that in the body and do a lot of work. So there's a lot of therapy and talking therapies, complementary therapies dealing with anxiety and stress in the body and ill health. And then there's social interaction, social projects that bring people together with similar experiences, so there can be a common kind of shared kind of understanding and bonding and empathy and support. And we do that through social activities. And then we're engaged with people that are applying through welfare and benefits. A lot of people we work with are on low income, not working or whatever. So you're dealing with a legacy of that through social welfare. So we have advice workers around that. There's a scheme that has come in that provides support to those people physically and psychologically injured as a consequence of the conflict. We've 7 people working on that, doing in and around between 2,000 and 3,000 applications, including a waiting list of people that are applying for that. And that takes quite a bit of work. Then we have the casework, legal and advocacy team dealing with justice issues. And Arati, that you met earlier, is the manager of that project. So there's quite a lot to the organisation and quite a lot of support. In our last financial year, we supported over 5,500 individuals. Some of them could be repeat individuals. You could come for counselling, be getting support with casework, and applying for something under the other schemes. So it count as 3, but it gives you a sense of the intensity of the work that we do. We only work with victims of the conflict. Nobody can come here and avail of the service. What we provide is completely free from the point of entry. There's no charge whatsoever. And we fundraise, and we do that. So we get statutory funding, some international funding, and we have a 501c3 not-for-profit based in the United States that generates income that supports what we do as well. So, there's a lot of work in sustaining what we do. But we're probably at the epicenter of everything, because in the context of dealing with the legacy of the past, there's been huge resistance. So what we did was we were involved with a law firm that was the law firm that had been started by the human rights lawyer Pat Finucane, who was killed. And we now know because David Cameron apologised publicly to the House of Commons and acknowledged that there was collusion by the intelligence agencies and lawyers to kill a human rights lawyer who was very effective at his job. So Pat had started and had been engaged in the tactic of judicial review and challenging the state around transparency and accountability for its actions, as well as representing people that were arrested. So in the context of what we were doing is we picked up on that work. Pat was killed in February 12th, 1989. So by the late 90s, we had developed a strategy of bringing a number of cases to the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. And we developed a strategy on the basis that we could not prove in a court of law within the British jurisdiction that there was a policy of shoot to kill or collusion. And that was based on the fact that the domestic investigative processes were so prohibitive to establishing the facts that you couldn't find out what went on. So instead of putting the killings on trial at Europe, we took the remedy process domestically, investigations, decisions not to prosecute when there's prima facie evidence that would have warranted prosecution, inquests, which most of these cases were railroaded into, an inquest being deficient in that they couldn't compel soldiers or policemen directly involved in killings. They couldn't go beyond the scope of the actual incident itself, and they couldn't return verdicts of unlawful killing. And that families did not get legal aid or financial support to engage in them, while the state used all the resources of the taxpayer to defend itself. So we put that on trial in May 2000, and in May 2001, the European Court ruled unanimously that the UK was in default of its investigative legal obligations in respect to killings it was involved in, or where there was allegations of third-party involvement through collusion. And that had a huge impact. Well, first of all, the Tories were saying that these judges are backward, different countries like Albania and other Eastern European countries, and they really don't know English, who can't speak English, and they don't know about the law, and they're inferior. So that was the initial reaction. Then it was, well, what about what the IRA did? And you always get that question whenever anyone has a difficult question that you put to them. They'll say, well, the get out of jail card for them all is, well, what about the IRA? Well, I'm not in the IRA and I'm responsible, and the families aren't. They're left picking up the pieces that buried their loved ones in the mud just as What the IRA did or didn't do isn't a defence when the state kills someone. It's about the rule of law and human rights. So that's where we are. We're in the whole prism of rights and advocating for rule of law and the administration of justice. And so we've proceeded legally through all of those things strategically to the point where the UK government was put under supervision by the Committee of Ministers to the Council of Europe for the execution of judgments that come from the European Court. So what does that mean? You don't put a government in jail for murder, but what you do is you put it under supervision that it rectifies and remedies the process domestically to then investigate those cases retrospectively. And the UK government found itself in a bit of trouble with that because then under the new rules, and then we had the Good Friday Agreement that incorporated the Human Rights Act, was the European Convention on Human Rights into the domestic legislator, which meant we didn't have to exhaust the domestic legislator or domestic courts and then go to Europe. We could do it directly in the domestic court. So with all of that, we began to make a bit of headway. So this provided a huge problem. And for the British government, in the big macro picture of it, they're looking at it and saying we're in trouble in all these cases. And some of these soldiers giving evidence, they'll probably say, well, we were told to do it. And so where does the culpability lie? Does it go up the Whitehall into Downing Street? Does it come back down? Where does it all sit? Who's in trouble and who's not in trouble? And in some senses, you had senior military and police officers saying, well, I'm not taking the rap for it. And so all of this was playing itself out as well. And then the narrative of the conflict was changing as well, insofar as the narrative from the state was that, well, you know, there's a lot of trouble there. It's Catholics and Protestants. We had to go over and stay in the middle and keep the peace between the warring tribes. We may have made a few mistakes in the course of doing that, which we're so sorry for. And really, that's the story of what's going on. When in reality, that couldn't be further from the truth. So, in the context of all of this, the British government's looking at this and they're saying, we need to deal with legacy. It's coming at us in every way, shape, or form. There's lots of opposition to what's happening within all the various military and policing institutions and security agencies, and we need to get a handle on it. And then the next thing is we have this Legacy Act.
The 2023 Legacy Act established new mechanisms for investigating Troubles-era cases and supporting victims, but it has faced controversy over its potential impact on justice and accountability. With Keir Starmer criticising the Act, many of those who disagree with it shared hope for the prospects of a Labour government following the 2024 general election.
The Legacy Act is really an amnesty act that clears the path. No British soldier will be investigated and there'll be no prosecutions. And then they realise, well, that's probably a bit blunt. If we make it that we can control who gets an amnesty and we can say it's for everyone, it looks fair, but it still violates the law. And that's been declared recently as unlawful. We've got the Irish government to lodge an interstate case and application of Stratford to take the British to the court over that. And Labour have committed, if they come to power in the next British election, they'll repeal all of it and everything will be back on. And we need to find a way around all that. So really, we're in the business of dealing with the legacy and the residue of conflict, the hurt, the pain on all sides. And that RFJ initially started off as an organisation that dealt with state killings because that's the people like I had a brother killed and a cousin killed. So that was the context in which motivated to drive us. And today we are open to anyone who comes here. We're working with lots of people in the community who have also been killed and harmed by Republicans, by loyalists, by all of it. So we're an open door. Unlike most groups, Wave will be the same. But there's a lot of groups out there that are working exclusively with people just killed by the IRA. We have an open door. Anyone can come here. And that's the principle in which we work. And that's the kind of a general synopsis when I draw a breath.
Relatives for Justice aren't the only charity group in Northern Ireland dedicated to this cause. In fact, there are many offering support to families and victims years on from the conflict. Wave Trauma Centre are just one example of this, and was set up in 1991 by 8 women who had lost their partners in the tragedy. Widows Against Violence and Power are the largest cross-community victims group in Northern Ireland, with 5 centres and 15 satellite projects across the country. Initially set up for the bereaved, Wave later expanded its remit to care for those who were injured or traumatised from the Troubles. I spoke to Dr. Paul Gallagher, a trauma education officer who was seriously injured in the conflict, about the work that Wave carry out.
Well, my own personal experience, I grew up here as a kid right through the 70s and 80s, and had been relatively unscathed and everyone happened to be in my family. But in 1994, my home was taken over by four gunmen. Um, they were there to attack my neighbour. They held me and my family hostage for about an hour. The neighbour didn't turn up, so they decided to shoot me instead. So I was hit 6 times. I was left for dead, but my family were there, managed to keep me alive, get the ambulance and got me down to the hospital. So recovered. Took a long time to recover physically, but in many ways I was left with spinal injury, left paralysed, and so I had to learn to live with that again. So I was lucky. I survived, but survived with these injuries and all the impact that has on your life ever since. Well, look, Wave's one of about 50 victims and survivor support groups across Northern Ireland. It was um, first constituted in 1981 by 8 women who were widows of the Troubles here. They came together just sitting around a coffee table and decided they needed to do something for people like themselves, because when they went for support services to GPs or to the any statutory services, just didn't exist. So they brought together a group of other like-minded people and basically started off from there. It's developed out into a charity which has 5 centres across Northern Ireland, a whole load of satellite centres too. It really helps to look after people who have experienced either bereavement, who have experienced some sort of loss, who have been injured as a result of the Troubles, and provides a whole range of services, including talking therapies, holistic therapies like reflexology, aromatherapy, outreach for people who maybe are isolated in their homes, health and wellbeing services, really to help people access other services that be beneficial to them, like physiotherapy, things like that. And also then the bit that I'm involved in would be trauma education. So that would be really looking after clients' needs, letting them know what trauma is, letting them know how they've been affected by the impact of trauma over the years, letting them understand how trauma affects the brain, how it affects the body, how it affects the way they behave, and things like that. So there's courses for clients, courses for organisations. We have a master's in trauma. We have an undergrad degree in trauma as well. So that's just a sort of gist of a few of the things that we do. Well, me personally, I came along to Wave first of all as a client. I was injured myself, a gun attack, back in 1994, and death with severe sort of life-changing injuries. So I first came along maybe about 15 years after I was injured, for services and things like that. And I've worked as a volunteer over the years. I worked as part of Wave's Citizen Education Programme, which is where people like myself and others who have been maybe bereaved go into the universities and speak to frontline workers of the future, so nursing students, medical students, social work students, counsellors, and the whole range of anyone who's going to be experiencing maybe trauma in their frontline work. So after I went back to college and did my undergrad in trauma studies myself, did a master's, PhD, I said it was time to get a proper job, and ended up coming here to work in the trauma education team to be really delivering the degree that I came through myself and other things too. So that's why I'm here now. Well, Wave was just sort of went from strength to strength, from that little acorn into this sort of mighty oak, as if you want to put it that way, into looking after thousands of people who come forward every year. Some clients who've been coming for a while, but a lot of new clients who come forward who have maybe experienced stuff going back to the early 70s and maybe only coming forward for the first time now. Maybe experiencing the impact of the British government's Legacy Act, which came through, which is really traumatise, re-traumatise a lot of people, because I think what it's done by stopping all investigations, by shutting down inquests, shutting down any hope for people finding out some truth, has really, yeah, really extinguished hope for a lot of people. And that was keeping people going, that maybe for them, that maybe people cared about what happened to their loved ones, and that society cares, whereas now the government's going, we don't care, we're just shutting it down. It wouldn't happen in Manchester. If it was a case of people being killed in Manchester, they wouldn't just shut it down after so many years and say, nobody cares about you. But it's happening here. And it's left a lot of people from right across the community angry, but also, yeah, just really frustrated and, yeah, again, traumatized. It's an act of cruelty, really, in our opinion.
So we've just finished at the Wave Centre. It's been quite an eye-opening day. Talking to Paul and talking to Mark earlier, it just leaves you all speechless. But they both seem so optimistic and like forgiving of what's gone on, and it just kind of gives you hope for the future. Seeking the knowledge of a political expert in this field, I spoke to ex-BBC Northern Ireland political editor Mark Devonport to gain insights about his experiences and thoughts on the topic.
Right, yeah. Well, just to say, I've spent most of my journalism career in Northern Ireland. I was a BBC trainee, originally from England, but I came out there in the mid-80s and basically stayed there. And I've had a few different job titles during that long time. During the 1990s, the IRA ceasefire and the Good Friday Agreement, I would have been known as the BBC's Ireland correspondent, mainly reporting for Radio 4 and for TV programmes in Great Britain. And obviously, that was probably the busiest period I've ever had in my career. It was fairly extraordinary because for many years, people had thought things in Northern Ireland would never change, that the Troubles were just going to be there forever. And sad to say, a lot of people in Great Britain, apart from when there were bombings across the water, had switched off to what was going on in Northern Ireland just because they had got used to it. But during that mid-1990s, it was really extremely historic, and in terms of working journalism, it was an extremely busy and strenuous period because suddenly all eyes were focused on Northern Ireland, the possibility that things could change. The 1994 ceasefires involving the IRA first and then the Loyalist paramilitaries afterwards were an incredible sort of break in what had been a kind of constant low-level violence up until then. And then the next few years, we sort of followed every twist and turn of the diplomatic activity that led up to the historic Good Friday Agreement in 1998. So it was intense, fascinating, and very much a 24-hour-a-day occupation.
What do you think about the current state of politics in Northern Ireland?
Well, it's much better than it was, of course, during the Troubles, because the Good Friday Agreement worked on a security level, in as much as it didn't provide perfect peace, but it definitely lowered the level of casualties within Northern Ireland, and also ended the bombing campaign, which had blighted life for many people in parts of England, including Manchester, of course, which was bombed back in the mid-1990s. With a lot of damage, but fortunately relatively low casualties. So it's changed things for the better on that level. There's absolutely no doubt about it. But it's not a perfect political solution because we've ended up with a rather polarised political system in which it's hard to make progress unless all main parties buy in. And that's one of the reasons why the Stormont Power Sharing Assembly has had periods when it's broken down, because if you don't get cross-party agreement, you tend to get use of vetoes and breakdowns. And so it's not the best governed part of the world, but it's much better than it was in the era when I was reporting in the sort of late 80s and early 90s.
Throughout this experience, I was honoured to have met people whose priorities and motivations are to help others and to recover from the past.
I thought it was important to find out what their hopes were for the future of Northern Ireland.
What do you hope for the future of Northern Ireland, specifically with the Legacy Act that was brought in last year?
Well, first of all, in terms of the general future of Northern Ireland, I obviously hope that it's going to remain stable and that it will be prosperous and that it will provide a sort of a happy place to live in for future generations, including my own children who were born and brought up here. So that's what I hope for the future. I don't really care whether it's British or Irish constitutionally. That's the people here to decide. But the main thing is that they should live happy and fulfilling lives. In terms of the Legacy Act, we'll have to see exactly what a future government does with that. And as we speak, the opinion polls seem to indicate that a future government may well be Labour. And I think that they will overturn some large elements of that Legacy Act because it seems to have been brought in mainly by the Conservatives, specifically to meet the concerns of military veterans in England, and it's been opposed by a lot of victims groups here. So I can see why they may well feel that more than a quarter of a century on from the Good Friday Agreement, it's time to kind of draw a line under things. But unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. If you're a family and you lost a loved one, you will kind of pursue it insofar as you can. And I think you've got to be kind of fair and just to everybody and give people the same kind of rights as they have in the rest of the UK, and that will be something that the Labour government will have to work on.
So, how hopeful do you feel about the future?
I'm an optimist because there's no room for pessimism here, and I wouldn't be doing the job I do if I wasn't an optimist. I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful Labour will come to power. I'm hopeful they'll repeal this act, and once they repeal this act, we're in this space, and that space is where the Stormont House Agreement was agreed in 2014 between both governments and all the parties. Like some of the parties have peeled off a little bit, but I think it was the best place we could have been in terms of the compromises made all around about finding a way forward. I really think this comes down to, I often say, in most spheres, you're certain of two things, taxes and death. And in the North, it's three things. It's taxes, death, and the battle for narratives. So the battle for narratives and maintaining and keeping an eye on that. I think this is a colonial, imperial kind of context as well, if you view it like that. This is the first and last colony of Britain. And in some senses, part of extracting yourself in the colonial context is to extract yourself from the situation with the minimum amount of blame. And you leave the blame behind for the other people that you leave in. Your unionists live here. Despite the historical kind of taking of land and the plantation of Ulster and bringing over people and giving them the land and because they're settler people and they're loyal to the crown. They're now part of, I come from that, my name's Thompson, so somewhere in the family line, and my mother's a McKenna of the McKenna kind of clan, an Irish clan. But we're a small population on a small island and we're intermingled so much. But our history and unraveling it and understanding it is significantly important to our future. So I'm an optimist of where if Labour come in, everything's back on the table. We need to resolve this. There's no going around this. And the history globally on these issues is if you do not resolve it, it comes back to haunt you. Look at Spain. Look at Franco. Look at all the turmoil of that. Suppressed for decades back. Central Latin America, it's been the same. Pinochet declared himself, Thatcher's great friend, declared himself an amnesty. No, those things came back. If you don't address it, you leave it, the legacy of it, and the hurt of it, to fester. And in some senses, for other people to manipulate and justify for continuing violence. So there's one way of traffic in this island, and Britain will leave it. The Good Friday Agreement, imperfect as it is, was brilliant in the sense of we got a stopping stone and a resting place, and within that is a border pull. So when the majority of people declare that they want Irish reunification, which I believe is going to happen within the next 2 decades. It'll certainly happen. Um, that's where we need to be building towards. And we need to find a common space where we all have the opportunity, and it can be exciting to rebuild a new Ireland. Part of this is all how do we deal with that? So Republicans have a big task in this as well in terms of the hurt visited upon unionists. And even though I had a brother killed by British soldiers, I'm very cognizant of the fact that 700 odd British soldiers were killed and sent home in coffins. Most of them sent home in coffins to Britain. And I often think, where are their families in this? Because on a human level, the humanity of that, notwithstanding all the issues around my brother being killed and the injustice and the hurt and the pain all that caused, that hurt and pain exists for people in their families, mothers and fathers, grandparents, siblings, children, and and they often don't get a mention in it. And the people that shout loudest about victims and about who is a victim and who isn't a victim are mostly unionist politicians who never lost a night's sleep in the conflict, never mind a night's freedom or a close one to them killed, a loved one. So I'd be very mindful of all of that. And I often think I met a wonderful woman whose son was one of the last British soldiers killed here. He was Stephen Restrick, and the IRA killed him in South Armagh. And his mother, Rita, came here. And I thought she was very brave. She wanted to understand where her son died, where the situation he came into, and how he died, and what were the circumstances, and why did the IRA exist. And she went on this amazing journey. And I've not had nothing but admiration for her. But when she realised the circumstances, she said, Britain shouldn't be in Ireland. My son should never have been here. What are we doing here? And she was on the end of so much vitriol from unionist politicians. There was a woman whose son came and gave his life for the union, for them. Kind of reminded me of the famous Spongers speech. I don't know if any of you have ever seen it, by Harold Wilson, when the workers' strike in England was happening. The collapse of the power sharing executive installment had happened here 50 years ago this year. And he gave a speech which basically said to unionists, you expect us to come here and send our soldiers and send all our money and build everything that's bombed and protect us and do everything. And there's not a bit of gratitude for it, and look at you do. And it was directed at unionists, because of course I have no affinity with the British state. I have no identification with Britain other than I support Liverpool Football Club. I think London's a nice place to go to. I have nothing against the British people per se. I just don't want them occupying my country. I'd like them to go and us to be lovely neighbours and friends. That's kind of the way I see the world. And for all of that, I've got myself in a lot of trouble since I've been no age. But that said, there's a lot of hurt on all sides, and the IRA was a very effective killing machine. Make no mistakes about that. And you know, and I family that were in the British Army and two of my uncles, and I hold them in the highest admiration. Went to jail in their teens, and that's the environment they grew up in. And my mother was the eldest, the matriarch of that family, and I spent many a day in prisons visiting my uncles with my mother. So, many of my close friends went to jail, and other close friends got killed in the conflict. So, there's some of us that suffered probably disproportionately, but in these communities here, as soon as you go into the Bogside and Derry or parts of wherever you come into West Belfast, it's not uncommon for people. They have had several members of their family incarcerated in jail for maybe being involved with the IRA. Had several members of their family.
My hopes are that obviously so many years on after the violence has ended, that in many ways that continues. I hope that people can learn to live together again. It took a long time for the Troubles to embed in. It was years in the making. It's probably going to take a long time for people to be able to, in many ways, especially those who have been harmed by what happened to them, it can take a long time to maybe forget about those old wounds. But in many ways, knowing guys who I meet within the injured group, which I'm involved with, and other members of WAVE, they're probably some of the most forgiving people out there as well. So I think in many ways people like ourselves can be maybe lead the way forward for reconciliation, proper reconciliation, where we feel safe around each other in the first instance. A lot of people still don't feel safe around each other, and that we have to take away that fear for people. But also that the young people coming through as well have the space and the opportunity to get to know each other, and learn to live with each other and fall in love with each other and have families with each other across the divide. And hopefully that is the way it'll pan out over the next few years.